The first 30 years of climate action were about global cooperation on divvying up the costs of mitigation, of decarbonization. When we think about making progress towards a clean energy economy, we often think about the cost of clean technologies. It's higher than the technologies we have right now, and cost is a big problem, but it's not the only one. We need to think about which of these coordination problems can private sector actors solve themselves, and where does the government need to come in? Central banks are not the only actors trying to manage these new climate and transition risks. Financial supervisors are also exploring this space. Investing in new energy technologies is costly, and if government tries to force companies and households to do that, there might be a lot of political resistance. I'm Jonas Meckling. I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and a climate fellow at Harvard Business School, Biggs.
While it's still premature to predict the outcomes under the new administration, what is your perspective on the IRA?
I think really two big perspectives on this. There's one view that says that the IRA will likely be cut and gutted to a large extent because the Trump administration is also pursuing a tax cut agenda. So they'll be looking for savings wherever they can. Another view is, well, the IRA is sticky because there are a bunch of Republican constituencies that benefit from it. There are Republican states that have invested substantially in clean energy manufacturing, but also industries that are core constituency of the Republican Party, like oil and gas, has invested in some low carbon technologies. And in fact, even before the election, the oil and gas industry lobbied the Trump campaign to keep some key IRA provisions that support oil and gas investments in hydrogen, in renewable fuels, but also carbon capture and storage. So those are two very different views, and I think in a few months we'll know more.
How should business leaders be thinking about this since we have some uncertainty right now?
Yeah, I mean, the uncertainty is huge and real. There's a lot of policy uncertainty and has impacted actual investments over the last year. We saw a lower uptake of IRA provision incentives over the last year as business investors were navigating the uncertainty around the election. But now it's really about making the case to the Trump administration that the IRA incentives are actually good for the US economy and have a place in what the Trump incoming administration is calling the energy dominance agenda for the US. And that can be done individually, that companies lobby individually, make their case, they're doing so, but also through trade associations collectively conveying that.
President Trump signed an executive order, and it relates to electric vehicles. What is your perspective on what may happen with that?
There is a lot of headwind coming on three fronts. The one is that the tax credit in the IRA for electric vehicles may be cut back to some extent. Another one is that the EPA tailpipe emission rule, that might be repealed. And lastly, that corporate average fuel economy standards, CAFE standards, might be relaxed. All of that would reduce demand for electric vehicles.
And what strategies might you have in mind for automakers if they are facing reduced incentives to buy an EV?
It's a real risk because the average EV would be 15 to 20% more expensive to consumers in the absence of the tax credit. And we have already seen a slump in demand for EVs from consumers prior to any cutbacks to the tax credits. And automakers have actually reduced their plans to some extent to electrify their entire fleets. So they again need to make the case for the continued existence of the tax credits. And the other strategy is a cost-cutting strategy to reduce the period until electric vehicles become cost competitive with internal combustion engine vehicles. We're not far from it, the point of what we call cost parity, so that they would no longer be dependent on government support.
What implications would the proposed policy shifts have for domestic manufacturing of EVs and their components, especially regarding U.S. reliance on critical materials sourced from China?
So The tax credits come with so-called local content requirements. For an electric vehicle to be eligible for these tax credits, a good share of the components needs to be sourced or produced in the United States. And cutting back these tax credits doesn't just impact the automakers, it impacts the entire supply chains. So all of these efforts would suffer from a cutback of the tax credits.
In your new research, you've compared the adoption of EVs and the development of charging infrastructure in Germany and in California. Why did you explore this topic? And then we'd love to hear some of your key takeaways.
So electrification of transportation is a core decarbonization strategy for the economy. And especially with regard to 2030 emission reduction targets, the transport sector is front and center. And California and Germany both are self-declared climate leaders. They have relatively ambitious emission targets. But on electrifying transportation, California is way ahead of Germany on a number of metrics, including the rollout of public charging infrastructure. So we were trying to understand, why is that?
Please tell us a few of your key findings and which surprised you the most.
When we think about making progress towards a clean energy economy, we often think about the cost of clean technologies. It's higher than the technologies we have right now. And cost is a big problem, but it's not the only one. As you deploy more and more clean technologies, you start changing the entire technological system, and you need to coordinate different parts, especially technology and infrastructure. So it's not that a single player can change the system. Multiple companies need to move in sync. So they need to resolve the coordination problem. And here we have a coordination problem between automakers selling EVs and electric utilities and other new startups selling charging infrastructure, providing charging infrastructure. And what we found is that this coordination problem was resolved much better in California than in Germany. There was more alignment. There were incentives for utilities in California to invest in charging infrastructure. And that has a lot to do with the regulated nature of the electricity market, where utilities are rewarded for capital investments into things like power plants, but also charging infrastructure. And in Germany, in a liberalized electricity market, utilities were not really having a viable business model for charging infrastructure immediately. So they weren't really coming on board. And this chicken and egg problem between supplying EVs and the charging infrastructure wasn't instantly resolved.
What would you say the lessons are for the United States?
Well, I think the bigger lessons really revolve around the issue of coordination, which is popping up in so many different ways. Charging infrastructure in EVs is just one case. We have the same between rolling out renewables further and building out transmission grid, or between expanding wind and solar energy and bringing energy storage into the grid to accommodate these new intermittent energy sources. And we need to think about which of these coordination problems can private sector actors solve themselves, and where does the government need to come in. And we're only beginning to understand really what the different roles are. There are a bunch of problems that firms can resolve themselves. For instance, we talk a lot about vertical coordination versus horizontal coordination.
What does that mean?
So vertical coordination means coordinating along the supply chains, bringing suppliers and buyers all in line. And that can happen through collaborative strategies or through vertical integration, that one company does it all. That was Tesla's strategy. They got into the EV market by having in-house battery manufacturing and by providing their own charging infrastructure. So that was one way through this vertical integration how they could be a leader without any other players already providing that. And then horizontal coordination relates to coordinating around competitors. That's, for instance, around technical standards, like having the same plug-in standard to that every car produced by US automakers can use the same plugs. Firms can resolve a lot of these problems. But then there are some where, especially around infrastructure, transmission grid, or energy storage, where government needs to either remove barriers to building that infrastructure or also incentives to make the infrastructure build out economically viable.
So Jonas, you recently did some work involving central banks. Tell us about it and what sparked your interest?
The energy transition and climate change entail a lot of risks for the global economy. And those risks are the physical risks of climate change itself, the droughts, the fires, water shortages, extreme weather events that threaten economic assets. But then there are also the risks of the energy transition, like stranded asset risks, so the loss of profit from retiring fossil fuel assets early, but also the risks that are related to new clean energy investments in less mature technologies. And in recent years, over the last decade, central banks have begun to manage these risks out of a concern that they may impact financial stability or macroeconomic stability. So central banks really have taken actions along two dimensions. One set of action is about what we call re-risking, embedding these physical climate risks and the stranded asset risks back into financial management practices. So that's essentially the prudential risk management role that central banks have always played. A second set of actions that they're taking is what we call the de-risking actions. That's actually lowering the risk of going to a clean energy economy, lowering the risk of clean energy investments. That's less a prudential risk management role, much more of a promotional role, shifting the economy towards a clean energy economy. We see a lot of activity on both, but central banks vary how much they are on the re-risking side, the de-risking side, or do both a lot. There are a few kind of leaders that do a lot of both. The European Central Bank, the Bank of England, but also the Central Bank of China. And why does the central bank do it versus why does another bank not do it? And from a kind of technocratic mindset, we would assume that where the risks are largest, central banks will manage most. But what we actually find is that that's not necessarily the case. What we find is that it's more where there's already a lot of political and policy action around climate change. In those countries, central banks are also taking action. So there are essentially complementing strong climate policies as opposed to substituting for the lack of climate and clean energy policies.
You just mentioned that China's central bank is very active on this front. Does that put United States businesses at a disadvantage?
This is an early stage where a lot of these activities are in information gathering, understanding the magnitude of these risks. These measures that actually provide easier access to finance to firms are still not too large in magnitude. I think the US is interesting because the central bank the Fed hasn't taken much action in re-risking or just de-risking. It's really in our scores at the very low end on both. But central banks are not the only actors trying to manage these new climate and transition risks. Financial supervisors are also exploring this space. And last year, the Securities and Exchange Commission developed a climate risk disclosure rule, which is one of these measures that in other places central banks are pursuing. Right now it's facing legal challenges, but that's where another actor than the central bank took action.
What will you be watching in the weeks and months to come?
Well, I think over the longer term, I'm really curious how this broader ecosystem of managing climate and transition risk is evolving. But I mentioned there are others. Financial supervisors is one group, and yet another one is private actors, like credit rating agencies that build climate risk and transition risk assessments into ratings for companies, but also for countries. And I'll be watching that space in particular to understand what the broader risk management landscape looks like.
You recently did some research into how countries have been managing energy transitions. Tell us about that research and what some of your top findings are.
So the clean energy transition is a global trend, a macro force, but countries move along at very different paces. Some lead, some lag. And in this project, we really wanted to understand why is that. And we went back into history to understand how countries responded to the oil shock of the early 70s with transitioning away from imported oil. And what we found is that there are really two pathways through which countries tackle the main problem in energy transitions. And what I see to be the main problem is political resistance towards that transition. Investing in new energy technologies is costly. And if government tries to force companies and households to do that, there might be a lot of political resistance. So the question is, how can governments adopt policies that promote this transition against a lot of political opposition? And one of these two pathways is what we call insulation. If the government is insulated from voter backlash or from business backlash politically, then they can adopt these policies. And that happens often when they have a strong autonomous bureaucracy, where career bureaucrats make essentially in a very technocratic fashion rules that shift the energy economy to a new technology future. And historically, we've seen this in the case of France, where a strong ministry forced the state-owned electricity sector to scale nuclear at rapid pace in the 70s. And Électricité de France, the state-owned electricity monopolist, then became the champion of nuclear globally. Today, surprisingly, California is pursuing this model. In California, it's a California Air Resources Board, an agency, an environmental agency that grew out of managing air pollution, and that's taken on a very strong role in climate and is adopting rule after rule and pushing ahead the California clean energy transition. So that's this kind of bureaucratic insulation path. A different path is compensation. When a country doesn't really have these types of agencies, it needs to strike a deal with those suffering from or having to absorb the adjustment costs towards a clean energy future, companies and households. And we've seen this in the past and today in Germany. In the 70s, Germany wanted to also reduce oil imports, as all Western economies. And it imposed a gas tax, a higher gas tax on its domestic economy. It imposed a coal penny on electricity users to then subsidize, compensate electric utilities for expanding coal and nuclear generation. So that was this deal. Costs on one hand or sticks on one hand and then carrots, subsidies on the other. They repeated that in the contemporary clean energy transition with the coal phase out. So Germany has a lot of domestic lignite coal, but that needs to be phased out to reach emission targets. And policymakers negotiated a deal with the electric utilities and mining regions worth $40 billion to phase out. But that money then helped diversify, helped those regions to diversify economically. And what made this really a stable bargain was that there were pre-existing negotiating tables, long-standing relationships between business and government, so that business could actually rely on this deal sticking around when the next administration comes into power and adjusting their investment accordingly. So these are two very distinct paths. Now, the United States, it doesn't have really the institutions that enable either insulation or compensation. And from early efforts in the 1990s to establish an energy tax to the failure of cap and trade bill, they tried to do that, oppose policies, but because they couldn't really effectively insulate from voter backlash or compensate voters and businesses, it never happened. So the US has adopted its very own style, not pursue any kind of policies that are impose costs on consumers and businesses, but just bankroll the transition. That's the IRA. It's a massive carrots-only approach to dealing with the political opposition to a clean energy transition.
Are there any lessons for the United States? I'm sure there are many.
Well, I think if you cannot impose these policies that have visible costs for consumers, then it's about dispersed costs. And that's the case of the IRA. Really, it's the budget. It absorbs these costs. And so every single taxpayer is not really that impacted. The costs are spread a lot across many as opposed to more few, and the costs are much less visible than if the government were to raise a gas tax or introduce a carbon tax.
Could you name like 3 leaders and 3 laggards?
A lot of countries in continental Europe have these institutions. Some are heavier on the insulation piece, a lot use the compensation piece, and they have made relative progress. China, of course, they have an authoritarian system which affords a lot of insulation, not absolute insulation, but that's one part of the Chinese story of the clean energy transition, that the government has the political means to overcome any potential opposition.
Please tell us about the paper that you just published in Nature.
So this paper makes the statement that we're in a new era of climate action. The first 30 years of climate action were about global cooperation on divvying up the costs of mitigation of decarbonization. Countries gathered in the United Nations and engaged in what they called burden sharing. How much should each country reduce emissions? And it was all about absorbing costs because clean technologies were costly. But in the last few years, we have entered, to some extent, a new era where it's not about cooperation costs, but competition for the benefits of decarbonization. And that is because clean energy technologies have become cost competitive or are very close to it. So now economies are vying for stakes in green industries because they see these as strategic sectors that can fuel future growth. And that's a very different dynamic. So now countries are adopting their own industrial policies to support their domestic green industries and often do so in response to other countries. China was first, and then Europe and the US responded to that, and other countries, South Korea, have all come in, Japan, and we see this green race. And that's a very, very different dynamic. It raises big questions how countries should design these policies to really effectively turn taxpayer money into viable, economically competitive industries, but also how to make sure that globally this doesn't just lead to a lose-lose or a battle for shares in industries, but that there is cooperation on scaling these industries and collectively achieving global decarbonization.
So is this good news for climate tech entrepreneurs?
It's certainly good news that a range of technologies are reaching maturity and cost competitiveness in markets. It's only, I would say, a good third of the climate problem because that's what's happening in the electricity sector and in the transportation sector with renewables and with electric vehicles. But 2/3 of the rest of the emissions are sectors where we have still technologies at a much more nascent early stage, where we need to either have breakthroughs in the lab that brings us new technologies that are much cheaper, or drive existing technologies down the cost curve to make them competitive.
And does your research then suggest that CEOs of big companies now realize that climate technology and climate solutions is essential for them to survive in the long run?
I think that's certainly a wake-up moment. I mean, the climate solutions data of HBS has shown this, that more and more public companies in the US are bringing climate solutions to market. And over the last 5+ years, I think their climate has gone mainstream, and it's a realization across industries that decarbonization is a macro trend. It's not just an energy sector story. It affects energy-intensive manufacturing, it affects financial services. It's really a broad technological transformation we're witnessing.